Today is Abraham Lincoln's birthday in 2024. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809 on this day, 12 February, and he was assassinated in office on the 15th of April, 1865. And if we don't know those dates, we should. His assassination is every bit as suspicious and as important of a turning point in American history as the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And his birthday used to be observed as a federal holiday, and then they lumped it all together as President's Day, and so fewer people today even know the birthday of Abraham Lincoln, 12 February. He is so important. I want to just briefly talk about Abraham Lincoln's three planks of his political position. We could call it Lincolnism, but really it goes beyond that. In his very first speech in 1832, announcing his candidacy for the state legislature of Illinois, he explained his political principles, and he said, "My politics are short and sweet," and here's what he said: "I'm in favor of a national bank, number one. I'm in favor of the internal improvement system, number two. And number three, a high protective tariff." That's it. That's all you need to know. National bank, we'll talk briefly about what that means, internal improvement system, and a high protective tariff. It turns out Professor Michael Hudson has written an entire book about this political system. The name of the book is America's Protectionist Takeoff. He explains that this three-part system was known as the American system. It is associated primarily with Henry Clay. Henry Clay lived from 1777 to 1852, so he's basically a generation ahead of Abraham Lincoln. Henry Clay ran for president a few times. This is the system of Henry Clay. It's exactly those three parts: a national bank, internal improvements, and high protective tariffs, in order to enable the nation to grow self-sufficiently, protecting its internal industries and improving its internal infrastructure. Internal improvements means building up your infrastructure. Canals like the Erie Canal, road systems, infrastructure, education. The American system relied on good education for the populace, so you had a educated, very high skill workforce, and the idea was to have a high wage workforce with low expenses because of the internal infrastructure. In this book that I just mentioned by Professor Hudson, he explains that the American school or the American system was a radical divergence from the British system. That's what you see over in the left, the Ricardian, named after economist David Ricardo, system. And he also calls that the Ricardian population theory. Great Britain had this Malthusian system. Thomas Malthus, whom I've talked about in other videos, Thomas Malthus was a clergyman in the British Empire who believed in population reduction and population control because he was afraid that the population would use up all the resources. The American theory is opposed to that. Every individual is a gift, a precious resource, the most important resource that your country has. So in this book, where Professor Michael Hudson explains the American system, he says there's the British system, which is about no tariffs. They want to have free trade so they can get a hold of the resources of other countries. And they want to have pauper labor. They want to have these vicious class distinctions where the lower classes are kept down and their standards of living are kept low so that they will be able to work for very low wages. If they're desperate, they'll work for low wages. You might recognize, like the system of today, the American system has been jettisoned. Nobody even remembers it anymore for the most part. That's what Professor Hudson explains in this book. There was this flowering of economic thought and economic writing about the American system, and it's been largely shut down and forgotten because the British free trade Malthusian Ricardian system has been replacing the American system. There was a struggle, and that's part of why Lincoln was assassinated, because he was for strong nations that are able to protect their own trade and protect their own industries and encourage their own industries and build up their own internal infrastructure for the benefit of their own people, as opposed to the British imperial system of taking the resources of other nations and keeping those nations in poverty. That's what you have seen around the world. That's the whole imperialist, colonialist system. Don't enable the peoples of the global South, Africa, South America, Central America, to use their resources for their own benefit. Don't allow their people to become educated and engineers for their own internal infrastructure. In fact, don't even let them build their own internal infrastructure. We don't want that if we're following this imperialist school. So this was a struggle. And notice there's a middle column there, Marxism. So Professor Hudson is saying the American system was against the Ricardian Malthusian system. So was Karl Marx. And the Marxist system was opposed to the British Ricardian system. But there was another path, the American system, the system of Henry Clay, and the system that you just saw. Abraham Lincoln was promoting that exact same system, a national bank, internal improvements, and protective tariffs so that you could encourage your own internal industry with infrastructure to make the inputs cheaper so that you didn't have to spend tons of money to drive your stuff around if you had a great highway system or a great canal system or a great railway system. And you had education being provided as part of infrastructure. And today, that whole system has been scuttled and jettisoned. And there was actually a major struggle in the United States over this system that was a big part of the Civil War. You see, the South, with its slavery system, they're producing basically raw material, cotton, and agricultural goods that they wanted to ship to England and the British Empire to be turned into garments and textiles and other manufactured goods over there. So the South, before the Civil War, opposed Henry Clay and this American system because they did not want protective tariffs. They didn't want protective tariffs because if America put protective tariffs to protect the northern industry from British goods coming in, the American system wanted to build up textile industry in America and protect it with tariffs. But the South said, we don't want tariffs because if you put up tariffs, then our goods will be more expensive over there in the UK, and they'll reciprocate by closing off and stop buying our stuff. And so this was actually a big part of the American Civil War, and the British Empire was openly on the side of the South during the American Civil War. The British Empire didn't want strong, independent nations to spring up, and you could argue they still don't. And interestingly enough, Abraham Lincoln invited and openly wanted Russia to bring its fleet over to guard the coasts of the United States during the American Civil War, and Russia did. Russia actually sent their fleet over to the American coastline to tell the British Empire, stay out of this fight. Stay out of this fight. Russia didn't do anything other than send their ships over, but Abraham Lincoln wanted to send that signal that Russia will keep France and Britain and the European imperialist powers from interfering in this civil war. And so it is quite possible that after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by agents of that same British Empire that was thwarted in the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln's moves. And so they had to destroy him a different way and go about the process of trying to dismantle this American system. So the protective tariffs question, you can read about it in this book that Professor Hudson wrote. That's pretty much the central argument that's shown in that book, the arguments for both sides. Today, free trade, free markets is pretty much uncontested in the United States. Almost nobody talks about protective tariffs anymore. That whole argument has been buried and taken over by Ricardian, Malthusian theory, as opposed to the American system that opposes it. So let's move to those second and third points, and they're actually very much tied together. A national bank and the internal improvement system. What Abraham Lincoln and Henry Clay are talking about there is credit being issued directly by a bank controlled by the government, as opposed to private banks and as opposed to the private Federal Reserve. All the functions of the Federal Reserve used to be performed by the U.S. Treasury. And the U.S. Treasury can issue credit for internal improvements as opposed to going through Wall Street and raising a bond that then Wall Street banks get a piece of. We don't have a national bank that's issuing credit for internal improvements and fostering American industry. Rather, we have individual private banks that are basically lending for speculation and lending against existing real estate. And if you want to get into this in much deeper detail, Professor Radhika Desai and Professor Michael Hudson just 2 days ago posted this interview and conversation called Economic Solutions: How to Go from Financialized Neoliberalism to a Productive, Sustainable Economy. And they talk about this very issue. So they talk about basically the issuance of credit by the government as opposed to the issuance of credit by private, speculative, private banking institutions. And it's more than I want to get into here, but these 3 points of Lincolnism and of Henry Clay's American system are very important to understand. They've been almost completely forgotten. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and removed almost certainly as part of the campaign to overthrow and bury this productive system. It is a system that is opposed to oligarchy. If you want oligarchy, class, vicious class distinctions, and exploitation, then you have to get rid of this kind of system. And that's exactly what has happened. And by understanding this system, maybe we can address these issues and turn the current disastrous situation around. And so today, on Abraham Lincoln's birthday, everybody should understand the importance of Abraham Lincoln, this 3-part system, and take some time to be grateful to Abraham Lincoln for everything that he did in holding the country together when people wanted to tear it apart, in freeing slaves and ending slavery in the United States, and in articulating this system which paid so many great benefits to the United States during the 1800s of internal improvements like the Erie Canal and the railroad system and the education system, and understand the difference between that system and what is going on today. Thank you.